Okay, let's get into the episode now. We want to start talking about Matt Tkachuk because obviously that was the insane news that happened just a couple of days ago, and we haven't really given our full reaction on it other than my quick story post as it broke at around midnight. I think it was Friday night. And so anyway, here's the deal. Matthew Tkachuk goes to the Florida Panthers with a conditional 2025 fourth-round pick. And in exchange, Calgary receives Jonathan Huberdeau, Mackenzie Weegar, Cole Schwindt, and a conditional 2025 first-round pick that's lottery protected. So, Case, what were your initial thoughts to the deal?
Well, you broke the trade to me via text, and I don't know what I was doing Friday night, but I was busy doing something, and I saw your text, and I was like, what are you talking about? Like, I couldn't believe the amount of stuff going Calgary's way. And I was like, well, what else is Calgary sending to Florida? Oh, nothing at all. A fourth round conditional pick. It actually blew my mind. And my initial reaction to this trade is like baffled. I couldn't believe it at all. But the more and more I start to think about it, like, I really don't know where I stand on this trade at all. I think it's all going to come down to what Calgary does with Huberdeau and Mackenzie Weegar next year. If they can sign them long term, if they can get them at a good contract, then they're walking away laughing with this deal. Like, I thought that Calgary, when they lost Gaudreau and we were starting to hear that Tkachuk was going to walk, we were saying, how can you start rebuilding with this back end and with an all-star goalie, like you said in text, locked up long-term for cheap? It's like, how do you start rebuilding now? And we were starting to get worried about Calgary, but with this return, it's like, oh, they're back in the conversation for, playoff contending and cup contending, really, in my mind.
Yeah, like, my initial thought to the trade, Case, as you know, kind of on the same page with you. Like, it was just shock and awe because, and actually, I guess before we get into that, I should add a few things about the trade that I didn't include right away for anybody who's been living under a rock here. Matthew Tkachuk was immediately extended to an 8-year deal at $9.5 per. So that was basically included in the deal. They wouldn't have done the deal if they weren't getting Tkachuk to sign. Both Huberdeau and Weegar are UFAs after this upcoming season. So Huberdeau right now makes 5.9, and he's done at the end of this year. He's going to need a new deal. And Mackenzie Weegar, one of the, probably a top 15 defenseman in the NHL, I would say. I don't think that's crazy to say. Makes 3.25 for one more year. He's going to need a new deal at the end of the season. Both guys, though, have already said to the media that they're open to staying in Calgary. So I totally agree. Like, this deal could look even better for Calgary if these guys end up re-signing. But yeah, so that was my initial thought. I was like, Huberdeau, personally, I think is almost as good as Tkachuk, maybe as good, could be better, depending on who you ask or in what kind of circumstance. And then Weegar, like a top 15 defenseman. And, you get all of this boatload, including that first round pick for Matt Tkachuk, a guy who literally told the team that he wasn't going to play for them anymore. So I don't understand where the leverage came from Brad Treliving, but what a deal this is. And like, this is probably, like, I don't know if this is a shock to say, Case, and like, tell me if you agree or not, but this might be the biggest trade of the salary cap era.
I don't know. I'd have to look back. That's pretty scary to get behind right away, but it's huge. It's like, it definitely tops the 1-for-1 trade in my mind, like instantly, even though that was franchise altering for my team. But this thing's huge, man. Florida, I don't like the Florida Panthers at all anymore. They just traded my two favorite players off of that team. I'm huge on both of these guys. Like, Huberdeau has been, sneakily one of my favorite forwards in the league the last 5 years. And Mackenzie Weegar is like my second favorite defenseman in the entire league. So that was just baffling to me. And man, just think about like a culture shift in Calgary and like the mindset of all these other players on their team. Like, the last 3 years, is all been talks about, Gaudreau's not going to stick around. They need to make a big change up to make an impact in the playoffs. There needs to be a change. Are they going to be a playoff team? It's all negative stuff coming out of there, including salary talks with Tkachuk. So it was like getting rid of those two players. Obviously you wanted something in return for Johnny Gaudreau, but being able to replace them with the second best passing forward in the NHL today, as well as a hard-nosed, all-around defenseman in Uyghur, I think they're laughing right now. And I think that this team is back. They're back already. And they have $36 million to work with next year. That's their projected cap space. The guys that they have to sign are Huberdeau, Milan Lucic, which is dropping from a $5.25 million contract. Trevor Lewis, Mangiapane is getting re-signed this year. Mackenzie Weegar, Valimaki, they're not too worried about what they're going to be doing with that $36 million, even if it's going to be, $11 million for Huberdeau.
Yeah, and I could definitely see that. Coming off a contract at 5.9, that boy is going to get paid. The reason I said it could be the biggest deal in like the biggest blockbuster trade in the salary cap era is because both of these players had over 100 points last season.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's a trade, at least I can't think of it off the top of my mind, where two players who scored 100 points were traded for each other plus on each side, So and so I wanted to get into that. At the end of this talk, I wanted to give grades to each team just quickly, because I know that's fun and you love that. That's your favorite thing to do. That's sarcasm. But I wanted to ask, like, if this deal were a 1-for-1, if you're Calgary, do you accept it? And if you're Florida, do you accept it? If this deal was a 1-for-1, and obviously the 1-for-1 being Huberdeau for Tkachuk.
I think, again, it really matters about Huberdeau and if they're going to be able to sign him long term. But my initial reaction is I would not have took this trade if I were Florida. Mm-hmm. And I would be running to the bank if I were Calgary, because you already knew that Tkachuk kind of wanted out of there. And I think that I'm so high on Huberdeau, and I'm really going to be interested to see for both of these guys the product of this change and their stats next year. Tkachuk, we don't have the history of him scoring over 100 points. We don't have the history of him scoring over 80 points. And he played on that one hot line that was on fire all year long. Now, on the other side of it, Huberdeau, he's got the history, but he's also been playing with Barkov for, his whole career. So it's like, I'm interested to see what these guys can do with their new line mates and how it's going to turn out for them.
100%. And a guy like Huberdeau, like, how many times have we mentioned this? He broke the literal assist record in the NHL for left wingers this season, with 85. And he's not even the biggest piece in the deal. I mean, according to for value's sake, anyways, that would be Matthew Tkachuk. Yeah. So, and I'm just looking at the stats here because I thought I'd compare them, briefly as we talked about this. Last season, Huberdeau had 30 goals, 85 assists for 115 points, played, just over 19 minutes per game, roughly, and, controlled the chances for and against 55.7% of the time. That was his Corsi. Tkachuk, on the other hand, 42 goals. So he's known to be more of a goal scorer, and we know that, than Huberdeau is. Huberdeau, like you said, is the incredible passer, maybe, top 2 or 3 in the league. And so Tkachuk had 42 goals, 62 assists, 104 points, played, about a minute less, almost about 18 minutes a game. Tkachuk did, and his Corsi was 59.3% all situations. So, very comparable. I'll say this, though. Huberdeau clearly has shown over his career that he has more of an offensive outlook, and he's produced offensively more than Tkachuk has. Tkachuk, though, underrated two-way player, like one of the better two-way forwards in the league. So there's just a bit of a stylistic difference between the two. Personally, I think these players are super close, like in terms of value, the more that I look at it. But the fact that Huberdeau was sent with Uyghur and a first and a former third-round pick, to me, is just completely shocking.
Yeah. I mean, there's other things that you have to take into consideration here, like that unquantifiable trait of Tkachuk and his shit disturbing and his physical play, and then also the fact that he's only 24 years old is huge for them as well. So there's a lot to go into this trade, but my last kind of comment on this one before we move on is to talk about PR or culture. And we're starting to see that it's kind of being a factor now. And it's starting to come out that, players don't want to sign with Vegas anymore because they just trade their players all willy-nilly. And the way they treat players is kind of a thing in Columbus for a while, although that's certainly changing now. Yeah. But Florida Panthers just traded their franchise leader in assists, games played, and points. I don't know if points is on there or not, but he didn't know that it was coming at all. Yeah. He actually thought the next phone call would be about contract extensions, and then he got the call that he was traded. And I just don't know if that's the way you should be treating your franchise best player.
Yeah, and man, I'm glad you brought that up, talking about Florida and the way they treat the best players who have ever played for them. Great place to play in terms of weather, but the organization hasn't exactly been, sunshine and roses to its players. And Exhibit A is Olli Jokinen. Do you remember a few years ago when his wife took to Twitter and mentioned that she returned to the BB&T Center for the first time, basically since Olli Jokinen had played for the team, and she noticed this there's a case, and Olli Jokinen's name was hardly mentioned. The fact that he was like their leading point scorer at the time, and maybe even goals too, and he gave so many seasons to the team, and in their trophy case on display, you could barely find Olli Jokinen's name. And it was like, what did he really mean to the city then if you're not even going to display your players? You go to the Scotiabank Arena downtown Toronto and you see Legends Row, right? You see statues of players. You go to Edmonton, you see Wayne Gretzky out front. You see the best players for that organization put on display. And Florida really now sort of is forming a track record of not appreciating their stars. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Exactly. No, it's kind of damaging moving forward in my mind. Like, obviously people want to move there because it's a great place to play, and due to the weather and tax and stuff like that. Yeah. But it's like players are going to start taking notice to teams not treating them the way they should be, especially when they're superstars. But really, everyone should be treated well. So
100%. Last thing I'll say about this trade before we move on here to the winners of the offseason so far is it's just something that I posted in our group chat and was talking about. Mackenzie Weegar obviously is a big piece of this deal, but he hasn't been talked about quite as much as Huberdeau or Tkachuk, because obviously those are the big names, and defensemen are sort of just always undervalued in terms of media attention unless you're Cale Makar. But man, Florida's back end is not scary anymore at all. After losing Weegar and after losing even a guy like Ben Sherratt, who they overpaid for at the deadline and got nothing in return for, their back end right now is essentially Aaron Ekblad on an island with a bunch of number 4 and number 5 guys. And that might be a bit disrespectful, but I think personally that's how I feel. Aaron Ekblad, Brandon Montour, Gustav Forsling, Radko Gudas, Lucas Carlson, Mark Stahl. Does that back end scare you at all? Doesn't scare me.
No, not at all. And I will say I like Gustav Forsling. He kind of showed that he could be a good pair out there with Weegar. His partner is now gone, so we'll see what he can do, but I'm assuming he's going to be playing with Ekblad. But yeah, that back end doesn't scare me at all. And on the flip side of it, Calgary's is moved up into a top 5 in my mind in the league.
For sure.
They're looking at Hanifin, Anderson, Mackenzie Weegar, Tanev, Shillington, and Zadorov. Like, I don't really want to play against that team at all. That's a lot of guys who can both move the puck and move bodies.
Every line, every pairing, it has at least one offensive weapon and a guy who can shut it down and make a good first pass. So that's...
Exactly.
Oh, man. That back end is going to be scary, for sure.